G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Israel, Past, Present and Future. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Thank you for coming along. We're now into session 16. We're into this area, Israel Future. We're looking at the four facets of the final restoration of Israel. We see that there are four primary facets to it, and each of them are based on a specific covenant. Last session, we looked at the basis of the new covenant, and now we're heading into the second facet, which is the basis is the land covenant. So this is the second facet of the final restoration, and this is a regathering of Israel from all over the world, and this is based upon the passage in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 1 to chapter 30, verse 10, and this covers the land covenant or Palestinian covenant. Now, the Deuteronomy passage begins with a very clear statement that the land covenant is distinct from the Mosaic covenant. Okay, the land covenant is eternal and unconditional. Remember also that the Mosaic covenant is both temporal and conditional. Moses in Deuteronomy then records in summary form the 40 years of wilderness experience now leading up to the point of being about to enter the promised land in verses 2 to 9 of Deuteronomy 29. However, before entrance into the land can occur, another covenant needs to be made in order to warn the Jewish people of things to come in verses 10 to 13 of Deuteronomy 29. They are warned against turning away from the Lord in verses 14 to 21. And then Deuteronomy 29 and then proceeds to state that they'll do exactly that. They're going to turn away from the Lord. And that's going to result in their dispersion out of the land into the Gentile nations, to then endure a very long period of many persecutions, which we find in verses 22 to 29. But this dispersion is not permanent. After this long period of persecution, there's going to be the regeneration of Israel as the people return to the Lord in Deuteronomy, well, what we see in Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 to 2. And then following the regeneration will be the regathering of Israel from all over the world in verse 3 of Deuteronomy 30. So that even if the Jews should be found in the uttermost parts of the heavens, they will nevertheless be returned into the land. They will then be brought back into the promised land in verse 5, and this regathering will occur only after the regeneration of Israel, at which time the punishments previously applied to Israel will now turn over and now be applied to the Gentiles. So while the curses will fall on the Gentiles, there'll only be blessings for Israel in Deuteronomy 30, verses 8 to 9, because they will all return to the Lord, verse 10. And then the land covenant now ends with some further admonitions, warnings, and promises in verses 11 to 20. So regeneration takes first before restoration back to the land. Yeah, we see the prophets speak about this. And we see Isaiah 11, verse 11 to Isaiah 12, verse 6. So what we see here is the regathering of Israel following the regeneration is another high point of prophetic revelation. And in this passage in Isaiah, the final regathering is now described as the second of the worldwide regatherings of Israel. So he says it's a regathering the second time, a worldwide regathering the second time. The first regathering, you might recall, the first worldwide regathering is one in unbelief prior to the tribulation in preparation for judgment. And this is what we're seeing today. Today is a worldwide regathering back into the land of Israel. Now, according to Isaiah 11:11, the second regathering is now going to be one in faith, and this is going to be in preparation for millennial blessings. This regathering is not simply a local regathering for the nations of the Middle East, but from all over the world, according to verse 12. Isaiah then goes on to develop some characteristics of Israel's final regathering. First of all, the unity between Israel and Judah will be restored. We see that in verses 13 to 14. And second, the final regathering will be accompanied by miracles in verses 15 to 16. The tongue of the Egyptian sea, the Gulf of Suez, will dry up, while the Euphrates will be smitten and split up into 7 smaller streams to make the regathering from all parts of the world that much easier. As a highway was made for Israel at the Exodus, there's going to be one again in the final regathering, and this is going to result in songs of praise in chapter 12, verses 1 to 6. Later on, Isaiah also writes in Isaiah 27, verse 12 to 13, and here he emphasized the totality of the regathering of every Jew, one by one, be brought back into the land of Israel. Now, this is the second regathering in faith. The magnitude of this final regathering of Israel is described in Isaiah 43, verses 5 to 7. So Isaiah says, as far as locality is concerned, he says the regathering will be worldwide from every part of the world. And to emphasize this fact, all 4 points of the compass are mentioned in Isaiah 43, verses 5 and 6. And then the magnitude of this regathering is then illustrated by the usage of 3 words: created, formed, and made in verse 7. Now, these 3 words are used interchangeably in the creation account of Genesis 1 to 2. So from God's perspective, the final regathering of Israel will be on the magnitude of the original creation. It'll be just a massive regathering from all parts of the world. The prophet Jeremiah also compared the magnitude of the final regathering with previous works of God. In Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 14 to 15, he likened it to the Exodus. Now, the Jewish people always considered the Exodus the high point of their history. And yet, after the final regathering, this will change in verse 14 of Jeremiah 16. In the future, it will be the final regathering of Israel that will become the high point of Jewish history in verse 15. Later on, in Jeremiah 23, verses 3 to 4, the prophet then stated that the Jews are to be regathered from all over the world into the land where they will produce much fruit, in verse 3. And furthermore, God will also provide righteous leaders who will feed the people with righteousness, justice, and understanding. Jeremiah 23, verses 7 to 8, again compares the regathering with the Exodus. Remember, the Exodus is the high point of Jewish history up to today. The final passage in Jeremiah that discusses the regathering is Jeremiah 31, verses 7 to 10. So following the regathering of Israel in verse 7, all the Jews will be regathered regardless of their state of health and regardless of their location, according to verse 8. There will be no hindrances whatsoever to the regathering, verse 9. For the one who was able to scatter them will also be able to regather them, we see in verse 10 of Jeremiah 31. Another prophet, Ezekiel, another major prophet, Ezekiel, picked up the same motif in Ezekiel 11, verses 14 to 18. What he's saying is that the same God who scattered Israel in verses 14 to 16 has every intention of regathering them back into their own land in verse 17, so that regenerate Israel can then cleanse the land of all pollution. That's verse 18. And then later on, Ezekiel restated this doctrine in Ezekiel 36, verse 24. Minor prophets also had something to say about this final regathering. Amos, for instance, Amos mentions it in chapter 9, verses 14 to 15. And here he emphasizes the permanency of this event. Israel is to be regathered in order to rebuild the land in verse 14 of Amos 9. And in the final regathering, God will plant them in the land so that they will never, ever again be uprooted and dispersed, according to verse 15. Prophet Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 18 to 20. The whole theme of his book was one of judgment, but he closes his book off with a promise of the final regathering in verses 18 to 20 of chapter 3. The judgment that was meted out against Israel is the result of her sins, verses 18 to 19. And then these judgments will not have a destructive effect, but they're going to have a corrective effect. And once correction takes place, the regathering will occur. And the final regathering will cause Israel to be a name and a praise among the Gentile nations in verse 20. The final prophet of the Old Testament to speak of the regathering is Zechariah. And he speaks about it in Zechariah 10, verses 8 to 12. Now, as Zechariah portrays the event, he saw it in terms of hissing. Now, hissing is a call of the shepherd for his scattered sheep. He hisses for his sheep. That's the first part of verse 8 of Zechariah 10. The regathering will then be a result of the redemption and the regeneration of Israel in verses 8 and 9. So while the regathering is to occur from around the world, there will be a special emphasis upon the Middle East nations, according to verse 10 to 11. And once all the Jews are regathered, they will never again depart from the Lord, verse 12. Now, what about the New Testament? Well, we see a couple of passages in the New Testament. In the New Testament, we have the final regathering revealed by the Old Testament prophets now being summarized in Matthew 24, verse 31, and Mark chapter 13, verse 27. And these two verses here state that the angels will be involved in the final regathering, and they're going to bring the Jews back into the land. So the emphasis in these two verses, Matthew 24, 31 and Mark 13, 27, is on the worldwide regathering. And these verses are simply just a summary of all that the prophets had to say about the second facet of Israel's final restoration. The verse in Matthew is actually based upon Isaiah 27, verse 12 to 13. And the verse in Mark is based upon Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 4. Now, its purpose was just to make clear that the worldwide regathering predicted by the prophets will be fulfilled only after the second coming. Now, we see the possession of the land. So we've seen the land covenant, see the possession of the land, and the basis is the Abrahamic covenant. This is the third facet of the final restoration of Israel, is now actually possessing the land. It encompasses two aspects. First of all, we're going to see its total boundaries, and then we're going to see its productivity. Now, the basis for this facet is the Abrahamic covenant, as found in various passages of the book of Genesis. The first passage to deal with the land aspect is Genesis 12, verses 1 to 3. At the time that this covenant was initially made between God and Abraham, Abraham was simply told to leave for a land that God would show him. Excuse me, have a drink. Now, so he's left his land, and when he arrived in the land, God again revealed himself to Abraham as described in Genesis 12, verse 7. He said unto him, unto your seed will I give this land. From this verse alone, some people will say that, well, Abraham himself was never to possess the land, it was to be his seed. So, question is, was Abraham ever to possess the land or just his seed? Well, another passage on the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 13, verses 14 to 17, makes pretty clear that that is not the case. For the time being, the area of grazing was divided here in Genesis 13 between Abraham and Lot, his nephew. Yet ultimately, All the land that Abraham could see was to be possessed both by him and by his seed, according to Genesis 13, verses 14 to 15. Now, since Abraham's seed was to possess the land as well, the population of Israel would then greatly increase, according to verse 16. Abraham was then directed to walk throughout the land in order to get to know it well. For someday, verse 17 says, he will possess it. So far, Abraham was only told that all the land he could possibly see would be possessed by him, but no exact boundaries were given. Later on, however, as God confirmed the Abrahamic covenant by signing and sealing it, he provided the information in Genesis 15, verses 12 to 21. First of all, he spelled out the future history of Abraham's seed prior to their initial possession of the land in verses 12 to 16. This is Genesis 15. And then God signed and sealed the covenant in verse 17, and he declared what the boundaries of the land will be in verses 18 to 21 of Genesis 15. The borders, God says, will extend from the Euphrates River in the north to the river of Egypt in the south. Yet Abraham died, never having possessed any part of the land except for a few wells and a burial cave, which he actually had to buy. So in order for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, two things have to occur. Abraham must be resurrected for the promise to be fulfilled, and the land must be restored to Israel. So after Abraham, the covenant was then later reconfirmed to and through Isaac, his son, in Genesis 26, verses 2 to 5. Isaac is here commanded to stay in the land and not to leave it in 26, verse 2. For it is to him, Isaac, and his seed that the land will be given in verse 3. Again, we need to note here that the promise of possession of the land is not simply to Isaac's descendants, but to Isaac himself. And so that also requires Isaac's future resurrection and possession of the land. Now, as for Isaac's seed, it'll be greatly increased in number in verse 4. It is to Isaac and not Ishmael that the Abrahamic covenant is reconfirmed in verse 5. Now, after Isaac, the Abrahamic covenant is then reconfirmed to and through Jacob in Genesis 28, 13 to 15. And if you look at these verses, it should be seen that it is to Jacob and not Esau that the covenant is now reconfirmed in Genesis 28, verse 13. The promise is made that the land will be given both to Jacob and to his seed in the second part of verse 13. Again, what we see here is that the possession of the land is not a promise to the seed only, but to the individual Jacob as well. And again, same thing. For this reason, Jacob must also be resurrected and possess the land. Now, as we saw previously, the seed will be greatly multiplied in verse 14. As for Jacob himself, who was now departing from the land, God will bring him back in his own lifetime in verse 15. So then, it is on the Abrahamic covenant, which is reconfirmed through Isaac and Jacob, and then to all of Jacob's descendants, that the third facet of Israel's final restoration is based. Now, what do we see the prophet saying about this? Well, this third facet of Israel's final restoration, possession of the land, was now further developed in both the law and the prophets. As far as the law is concerned, it's found in Leviticus 26, verses 40 to 45. Leviticus 26, 40 to 45. So following the regeneration of Israel in verses 40 to 41, God will fully carry out the promises of the Abrahamic covenant concerning the land in verse 42. On the basis of the Abrahamic covenant, he will restore to the Jewish people the land that has laid desolate for so long in verses 43 to 45, Leviticus 26. In another part of the law, Deuteronomy 30, verse 5, it says the possession of the land is also mentioned as being part of the land covenant. Now, the prophets of Israel develop this facet even further in both the major and the minor prophets. One verse is Isaiah 27, verse 12, which brings out the first aspect, the borders of the land. The northern border, or the Euphrates River, and the southern border, the Brook of Egypt, these boundaries are possessed for the first time in Jewish history. Israel will be able to settle in all of the promised land. In Isaiah 30, verse 23 to 26, the second aspect of the third facet is stressed, and we're going to see increased productivity of the land. The land will be well watered and will produce abundant food both for men and animals. Isaiah 30, verse 23 to 25 tells us. Also, there's going to be a tremendous increase of light, with the moon shining as brightly as the sun, while the light of the sun will be increased 7 times of what it is today. Just the light of the sun, not the heat of the sun, it's the light of the sun. As for the deserts of Israel, Isaiah 35, verses 1 to 2 says, "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of Jehovah, the excellency of our God." Now, Isaiah later brought out the productivity aspect again in Isaiah 65, verses 21 to 24. Now, with the possession of the land, not only will the Jews be able to build houses and plant vineyards and crops in verse 21 of Isaiah 65, but they'll also enjoy the work of their hands, for no enemy will any longer take it from them. They'll enjoy it until they reach a ripe old age, according to verse 24. Another one of the major prophets, Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 31, 1 to 6, he also stressed the great productivity of the land. Because of God's everlasting love for his people, in verses 1 to 3, Jeremiah 31, he intends to restore and build them again in verse 4. And once again, we see that there's going to be a time of plenty for Israel, and the hills of Ephraim will echo with the call to come and worship God in Jerusalem in verse 6. Jeremiah then returned to the same theme a little later in chapter 31, verses 11 to 14. So after the redemption of Israel in Jeremiah 31:11, the people will be restored to the land, which will produce an abundance in verse 12, giving joy to all the inhabitants of the land in verses 13 to 14. Prophet Ezekiel also picked up the same motif of the possession of the land in chapter 20, verses 42 to 44. The Jewish people, we see here, are brought back into their land in accordance with the promise of God to the forefathers in the Abrahamic covenant of verse 42. Israel will then turn away from her sins of the past and will detest them in verse 43 and now serve God alone in verse 44. And later on, we see in Ezekiel 28, 25 to 26, following her regeneration and her regathering back into the land, Israel will then possess the land in accordance with the Abrahamic covenant in verse 25. And the security in which Israel will live and enjoy the works of her hands is then emphasized in Ezekiel 28, verse 26. The security aspect, along with the element of increased productivity, is also the theme of Ezekiel 34, 25 to 31. Since there'll no longer be any wild beasts in the land, Israel will be able to enjoy the land in total security in verse 25. The rains will come in their proper time and in proper amounts in verse 26, increasing the productivity even further in verse 27. Not only is Israel to be secure from wild beasts, but she'll also be secure from all her enemies of the past in verses 27 and 28. None will come to destroy the crops in verse 29. In every way, Israel will be rightly related to God and will be his peculiar possession in verses 30 to 31 of Ezekiel 34. Ezekiel 36, verses 8 to 15, we see here that the land is tilled again despite years of desolation in verses 8 to 9. Also, it's going to be populated. That is, the inhabitants of the land will be greatly increased in verses 10 to 11. Israel will possess the land in verse 12 of Ezekiel 36. And the productivity of the land will be tremendous in verses 13 to 15. In Ezekiel 36, 28 to 38, the prophet now further elaborates on these statements. He repeats that Israel will possess the land in verse 28 as a result of her regeneration in verse 29. The reproach of Israel will now be removed in verse 30, and Israel will detest her past sins in verse 31. And it is not, all of this is not for Israel's glory in verse 32. It's for someone else's glory. The regeneration we see in verse 33, the possession in 34, rebuilding of the land in 35 will occur. And everything here is going to be for God's own glory among the nations in verse 36. Now, as for Israel, the population will increase and the desolate places will once again be rebuilt in verses 37 to 38. Possession of the land is also promised in the minor prophets. Joel chapter 2, verses 18 to 27. In verse 18 of Joel chapter 2, God will be jealous for his land, and this burning jealousy will bring about a great productivity in the land in verse 19. And the land will be secure from any further invasions in verse 20, and it will produce abundantly in verses 21 and 22. The rains are going to come the proper seasons and in proper amounts in verse 23, and it's going to cause a tremendous amount of surplus of crops, verse 24, and it's going to recoup all the previous losses due to pestilences in verse 25. Israel will never again be shamed in verse 26, but she's going to have a special relationship to her God in verse 27 of Joel chapter 2. In Joel chapter 3, verse 18, the prophet then declared that there will be an abundance of water in the land. The increased productivity of the land is again pointed out in Amos 9, verse 13. For the first time in Israel's history, she'll possess all of the promised land, while the land itself will greatly increase in its productivity and be well watered. All of this is on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. Now, we need to see the reestablishment of the Davidic throne. And what's that based upon? Well, that's based upon the Davidic covenant. The Davidic covenant. This is found in two passages of scripture. We see it in 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 to 16, and 1 Chronicles 17, verses 10 to 14. Let's look at the first one. In the first passage, 2 Samuel 7, 11 to 16, it explains that through this covenant, this Davidic covenant, David is first promised headship of a dynasty or a dynasty. Verse 11, after David dies, the throne will then go to one of his sons, and that was Solomon, and the kingdom will be established in his hand in verse 12. It is Solomon who's going to build the temple, and so God will establish his throne, not Solomon himself, going to establish his throne for eternity in verse 13. Solomon will sin, and God will have to discipline him, but God's loyal love will not be removed from Solomon as it was removed from Saul. That's in verses 14 to 15. Saul was the first king. Nevertheless, the Davidic house or dynasty, the Davidic throne, and the Davidic kingdom will now be eternal according to verse 16. So this first passage on the Davidic covenant focuses on the person of Solomon. Now, we have a slightly different emphasis in 1 Chronicles chapter 17, second part of verse 10 to 14. Here the focus is not upon Solomon, but it is upon the Messiah. David is promised a dynasty in verse 10, second part. Sometime after his death, a descendant of one of his sons will be established in the kingdom in verse 11. While the Samuel passage spoke of one of David's own sons, Solomon, Chronicles speaks of a descendant of one of his sons, namely the Messiah, who was a descendant of David's son Nathan. This descendant of David, the Messiah, will also build God a temple. That's going to be the millennial temple, and his throne will be established forever. Verse 12. God's mercy will never be removed from this one, verse 13, this one who will be ruling. Since the Samuel passage emphasized Solomon, there was the possibility of sin. Since the Chronicles passage emphasized the Messiah, there is no possibility of sin, and that is why there's no mention of sin in the First Chronicles 17 passage. It is this person himself who is established forever, and not merely the dynasty, kingdom, and throne. That's verse 14. The Davidic throne, the Davidic covenant promised 4 eternal things. It promised an eternal dynasty, an eternal kingdom, an eternal throne, and an eternal person. Now, the eternalness of the dynasty, kingdom, and throne are guaranteed only because of the seed of David culminating in a person who is himself eternal, and that is Messiah Jesus. Messiah holds 3 different offices. He holds 3 offices: prophet, priest, and king. However, he does not function in all of these offices simultaneously. The functioning of these 3 offices is to be carried out in chronological sequence. During his ministry on earth in his first coming, Messiah functioned in his office as a prophet. The office ceased at the time of his death. Since his resurrection until he returns, Messiah is now functioning in his office of a priest, high priest. And this duty will then cease at his second coming. Jesus has never yet functioned in his office of a king. For him to do so, there must be the reestablishment of the Davidic throne upon which he will sit to rule as king over Israel and king of the world. So this duty of kingship will then begin at the second coming. Now, what's the prophetic development for this? Well, Psalm 89, for instance, Psalm 89 is totally devoted to this theme. In this passage of Psalm 89, God states that he has made an eternal covenant with David in verse 3, including the establishment of an eternal dynasty and an eternal throne in verse 4. The eternalness of the dynasty and the throne is restated later in verse 29, and still later in verses 34 to 37. The psalm states that the continuation of the covenant is not dependent upon David or upon his descendants, but upon God's character in verse 34. Since God does not lie, the covenant is sure to stand in verse 35. And for that very reason, the eternalness of the dynasty and the throne is now assured in verses 36 to 37. Messiah ruling upon the re-established throne of David and ruling over a kingdom is the theme of Isaiah 9, verses 6 to 7. A child is born into the Jewish world. He's the son of the house of David, and the reins of government will rest upon him, according to the first part of verse 6. However, names are given to this child that can only be true of God himself in the second part of verse 6. The eternalness of the Davidic dynasty, throne, and kingdom is assured, for it rests in this child, the God-man. As to his humanity, he's a descendant of David. As to his deity, he is eternal, and so is his throne. So with these facts clearly established, Isaiah then proceeds to describe the establishment of Messiah's rule. The government that will be set up will increase in authority and in peace. There will be no end to the throne of David or to the rule of Messiah, for it is a God-man who will rule, who will establish this rule, and who will uphold it. It'll be characterized by justice and righteousness forever. The guarantee that it will be so established is the zeal of God, a zeal that will continue to burn until the kingdom is realized. Since God's zeal intends to perform it, it will surely come about in verse 7. Now, to Isaiah 9, Isaiah 16, verse 5 adds, "And the throne shall be established in loving kindness, and one shall sit thereon in truth, in the tent of David, judging and seeking justice and swift to do righteousness. So Isaiah here, as if to reiterate the previous statement, he again declares that a throne will surely be established on the basis of God's loyal love. The one sitting upon the throne will be a member of the house of David, who will be characterized by truth. He'll be king and judge, ensuring that justice is carried out, a justice springing from the righteousness of the king. Very similar to Isaiah are two prophecies found in Jeremiah. The first one is Jeremiah 23, verses 5 to 6. Again, what we see here is that there is a descendant of David who will sit upon David's throne. Yet this descendant is called Jehovah, our righteousness. So the one sitting on David's throne is none other than the God-man. And because it is the God-man, his reign will be characterized by wisdom, justice, and righteousness. It is in him that the security of Israel will now lie. Second passage is Jeremiah 33, verses 14 to 26. The emphasis in this passage is clearly on the eternality of the impossibility of breaking the Davidic covenant. Beginning with the reaffirmation of God's intention to fulfill this covenant, or fulfill his covenant with David in verse 14, Jeremiah then restates the basic points of his statements in verses 5 to 6, of the statements that were in verses 5 to 6, in verses 15 to 16. Under no circumstances will the house of David ever become extinct, according to verses 17 to 18. For the Davidic covenant is both unconditional and eternal, which we see in verses 19 to 21 of Jeremiah 33. So ultimately, the seed of David will be greatly multiplied in verse 22. The reestablishment of the Davidic throne will then be the antidote to the poisonous teaching that God no longer intends to fulfill his covenants with Israel, which we see in verses 23 to 26. God is not through with Israel, verses 23 and 24 of Jeremiah 33, but he will fulfill every promise of the Davidic covenant in verse 25 and 26, and the Abrahamic covenant in verse 26. In Jeremiah 33, verse 24, considerest thou not what this people have spoken, saying, the two families which Jehovah did choose, he hath cast them off. Thus do they despise my people, that they should be no more a nation before them. So that's what Jeremiah 33, 24 says. But God is saying, no, no, no. I'm going to fulfill my covenant with the nation of Israel. I have not cast them off. Another passage in the Hebrew scriptures is Amos 9, verse 11 to 12. When the kingdom is established, the ruins of the house of David will be repaired, and the Davidic throne will again exhibit all the glory of the days gone by, which we see in verse 11 of Amos 9. In addition to all the glory of the past, the authority of the re-established Davidic throne will extend to all the Gentile nations in verse 12. In the New Testament, the re-establishment of the Davidic throne is found in Luke chapter 1, verses 32 to 35. All four key aspects of the Davidic covenant are mentioned here. The Messiah is to sit upon the eternal throne, ruling over an eternal kingdom, for he was born into the eternal dynasty. The eternalness of the dynasty, throne, and kingdom is assured because they all culminate in the person who is himself eternal, the Son of God. Now, some other characteristics of Israel's final restoration. Besides the various features mentioned in the passages dealing with the covenants and their prophetic developments, other passages present additional characteristics that may or may not necessarily be connected with any specific covenant, but would be true at the time of Israel's final restoration. We're going to see, first up, they're going to be reunited as a nation. One of the major features of the final restoration is that Israel will be reunited as a nation, never to be divided into separate kingdoms again. Remember, they got divided after the death of Solomon into Israel and Judah. Now, this is mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 18. In those days, the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north to the land that I gave for inheritance unto your fathers. The key passage for this characteristic is found in the vision of the valley of the dry bones in Ezekiel 37, verses 1 to 14. Ezekiel is first commanded to prophesy over the dry bones which are scattered all over the valley in verses 1 to 6 of Ezekiel 37. And when he does, the bones all come together with sinews and skin, and then the breath of life is given to them, so they become alive again, in verses 7 to 10. As God interprets the vision in verses 11 to 14, these bones are said to represent the whole house of Israel, which has become spiritually dead and dispersed. Verse 11. Yet what we see is that God is going to regather his people, and they'll again possess the land in verses 12 to 13. And at that time, Israel will be regenerated by the Spirit of God so as to have a living and right relationship with him in verse 14. And then in Ezekiel 37, verses 15 to 23, the prophet is then commanded to take 2 sticks. On one stick, he is to write the name Judah, and on the other stick, Joseph. Then he's to put the 2 sticks together so they become 1 stick in his hand in verses 15 to 17 of 37. The interpretation here is that Israel and Judah, the 2 kingdoms, will someday be reunited into one nation in verses 18 to 20. So when the regathering of Israel occurs in verse 21, the kingdoms will not be regathered into 2 nations, but only into one. For they'll be under one king in one kingdom in verse 22. And at that time, they'll be thoroughly cleansed of their sins, which were the root cause of the original division. The second major characteristic of Israel's final restoration is that the nation will become the center of Gentile attention. And several passages speak of this. One of them is Isaiah 14, verses 1 to 2, which we see that after Israel's regeneration and restoration in the first part of verse 1, Gentiles will then align themselves with the nation in order to worship the God of Israel in the second part of verse 1. In fact, not only will Israel's regathering be accomplished with the help of angels, but the Gentiles will also be escorting the Jews back into the land in the first part of verse 2. And finally, Israel will possess the Gentiles who will become her servants in the second part of verse 2. A similar thing is said in Isaiah 49, verses 22 to 23. The regathering of Israel will be accomplished with the aid of the Gentiles who will lead the Jews back into the land in Isaiah 49, 22. And at that time, the Gentiles of all social strata will become the servants of Israel in the first part of 23. And Israel will never again be shamed by them in the second part of 23. According to Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 to 3, Israel will now become the center of Gentile attention because the Shekinah glory will now abide in the land. According to I have another drink. Hang on. According to Isaiah 61, verses 4 to 9, when this regathering takes place, Israel will rebuild all the desolate cities of the land in verse 4. And at that time, the Gentiles will become servants to Israel and will feed the flocks and plow the fields in verse 5. As for the Jewish people, they will be the ministers of the word to the Gentiles and will receive the wealth of the Gentiles for their enjoyment in verse 6. Israel will never again be shamed by the Gentiles, but rather will receive a double portion of all blessings and possessions in verse 7, Isaiah 61. And this will be the result of the new covenant in verse 8. The Jewish people will be known among the Gentiles, and all the Gentiles will acknowledge that it is the Jews who have been specially chosen by God for special blessings. Verse 9. Now, Isaiah's contemporary Micah also had something to say in this regard. According to Micah chapter 7, verses 14 to 17, Israel is to be regathered in order to possess the land, which you see in verse 14, Micah 7. This regathering will be accomplished by miracles in verse 15. And when the Gentiles see it, they will cease reproaching the Jews and will have a reverential fear of them. And they will then submit to the God of Israel in verses 16 to 17 of Micah 7. That Israel's final restoration will cause the Jews to become the center of Gentile attention was also revealed in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 20. Zechariah 8:23 finally states, "Thus says Jehovah of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all the languages of the nations. They shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." In the past, when 10 Gentiles grabbed the clothes of a Jew, it was for other reasons than to say, let us go with you, for we have heard God is with you. At the time of the final restoration, the Jews will no longer be reproached. Instead, they'll be treated with reverential respect, for they'll be known as the ministers of God. The fact that Israel was to become the head of the Gentiles was part of God's promises to Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 15, verse 6, and Deuteronomy 28, verse 13. According to Deuteronomy 28, verse 1, the leadership over the Gentiles was to be one of the rewards for obedience. Such obedience and headship await Israel's national regeneration. The prophets also described Israel's future headship over the Gentiles in Isaiah 14, 1 to 2, which we've seen before, Isaiah 49, 22 to 23, and Isaiah 61, 6 to 7. We looked at all these verses previously. So we're going to see, again, the Gentiles will be the servants of Israel, will be possessed by Israel in 14. They'll be the servants of Israel in 49 and also in 61. Another feature of Israel's final restoration combines the various characteristics of righteousness, holiness, peace, security, joy, and gladness. Righteousness and peace are the primary characteristics found in Isaiah 32, verses 16 to 20. Holiness, peace, security, and joy are emphasized in Isaiah 35, verses 5 to 10. These are all things that will earmark the time of Israel's regathering. Joy and gladness are stressed in Isaiah 51, verse 3. Joy and peace in nature and man are highlighted in Isaiah 55, verses 12 to 13. And Isaiah 61, 10 to 11, the emphasis here is on the aspect of righteousness in the regathered Israel. And that is where we will finish it for this session, and study hard and grow strong. And thank you for coming along.